And thank you for coming, and thank you for staying until the end of this long symposium. Before I begin, I would like to thank a couple of people that have been really instrumental in all the research studies that I'm going to present today. Steve Petruzzello from the University of Illinois and Eric Hall, who is now at Elon University, as well as my PhD students, Roxanne Jones-Maitre and Eric Lind, and the good people who have been willing to fund the research that we do. Just to present the context again and remind everybody the working hypothesis that we're working from, we assume, although this has never been tested, that there is a causal chain linking the intensity of physical activity to affective responses, pleasure, displeasure, enjoyment, and so on, and finally to adherence. What I'm going to concentrate on is the first critical link between the intensity and affective responses. At this stage, the closest thing that we have to a conceptual model of this relationship is something very familiar. It's the inverted U. And the inverted U idea basically says that there's such a thing as low or too low intensity that is ineffective, doesn't do much in terms of changing affect. There's such a thing as high or too high intensity, and that could be ineffective. In other words, it doesn't cause any affective benefits, or in some cases may actually have aversive effects. And therefore, somewhere in the middle, we have a poorly defined moderate range of exercise intensity that supposedly optimizes the conditions for affective change. Now, there are a couple of limitations. The first, and I think most important, is the fact that the inverted U really, if you look at the entire literature, does not account very well for the findings that we have so far. For example, there are repeated findings that low-intensity exercise, 15, 20% of max, for example, does have positive effects. It is nomothetic. In other words, it assumes a simple stimulus-response effect, and therefore does not account for inter-individual variability. And finally, it is only descriptive. It doesn't provide a mechanistic explanation as to how we arrive at the affective changes. So if we were to become idealists, I guess, and try to find all those desirable properties that we would like a new conceptual model to have, we could perhaps say that it should recognize that affective responses are very complex phenomena, and they can range anywhere from very simple displeasure and pain and discomfort or excitement and so on, all the way to very complex emotions like anxiety and pride and guilt and so on. Second, we would like it to account not only for the positive, as has been the case with many of our prior assumptions, but also for the negative effects of exercise. We would like it to have a good fit to some type of dose-response pattern. We would like it to account for inter-individual differences, and we would like it to have neural underpinnings that are consistent with everything that is emerging from neuroscientific research. Well, that's a very tall task. Last year, I published a paper that proposes a very basic, rudimentary conceptual model that we would like to investigate further in the future, and it is the model that I would like to describe to you today. It's called the dual mode model of exercise-induced affective responses. So the outline of my talk today, I'm going to present the general framework of this theoretical idea. I'm going to present 4 fundamental assumptions. Then I'm going to present the basic postulates or hypotheses associated with the model. And then, if you bear with me through all this theoretical stuff, then at some point, I promise I'm going to show you some data organized in 3 different categories, and finally reach some conclusions and application and recommendations for practice. Here's the starting block. I'm starting from this fundamental principle, that there is a question that is, I think, very important, but we have overlooked so far. And that is the question, why would humans feel anything pleasant or unpleasant during and after physical activity? Essentially, this is a question that arises from evolutionary theory and evolutionary psychology. In evolutionary psychology, psychological mechanisms are theorized to be the products of evolution, and they are shaped as a joint function of an adaptive problem in the ecological setting, in the ecological environment where humans live, and a neurophysiological basis. So I'm going to go through 4 fundamental assumptions now that form the basis or the foundation for this theory. I'm going to go through them one by one. So fundamental assumption number 1 is that physical activity is an integral part of the human environment of evolutionary adaptedness, which is basically the environment that for eons shaped human evolution. And I assume that physical activity has been, throughout this entire period, essential to human survival. What are the adaptive problems related to physical activity? I think there are 2 kinds. One must be physically active to survive. That's necessary if one is to gain access to resources and mates, and therefore some forms of physical activity are adaptive. They contribute to adaptation. The flip side, one must be able to survive while being physically active, because we know that physical activity can be deadly, can have some negative impact on health and survival. So some other forms of physical activity are in fact maladaptive. Fundamental assumption number 2 is that affective responses are manifestations of psychological mechanisms that evolved through the process of natural selection for their ability to solve persistent adaptational problems. And in this context, pleasure signifies utility and displeasure signifies danger. There have been 2 recent, they were published about 5 months ago, 2 recent studies that I think are of tremendous importance for the kind of research that we do. The first one was a human genetic study that examined the relationship between a polymorphism of the dopamine D2 subtype receptor and physical activity participation. Now, the important thing for us is that why would they focus on the dopamine D2 receptor? The reason was because they assumed that participation in physical activity is facilitated by affective responses. And the dopamine network has been linked to reward and pleasure. And they in fact did find that this particular polymorphism was associated with physical activity participation. So perhaps affect is the link. There was a second study that was an animal study, was done with mice and voluntary will running behavior, and it followed a very similar rationale, and also showed that as a result of artificial selection, runner mice had essentially evolved some areas of the brain that were specifically linked to reward, presumably pleasure, and those were the areas of the brain that were most closely associated with the motivation to run on a running wheel. So what is useful activity? That's a hard question to answer. We assume that useful activity is the type of activity that humans had been doing, no longer, but had been doing for many generations. Such things as hunting activities, scavenging activities, foraging, gathering. The intensity of those types of activities, at least as far as what the anthropologists are telling us, based on the few remaining groups of people who continue to live in the hunter and gatherer lifestyle, is that this is a steady state, prolonged for up to 6, 7, 8 hours a day, presumably below the aerobic anaerobic transition type of activity. What is dangerous activity? I'm going to presume that dangerous activity, in quotation marks, is the activity that exceeds the intensity that corresponds to the aerobic anaerobic transition. There are some reasons for this. One is that this type of activity generates a very negative, unpleasant, aversive internal environment, and that is the environment associated with acidosis. There's accumulation of hydrogen ions dissociated from lactate, the pH falls. Above the aerobic anaerobic transition, we have higher oxygen cost of work, It is difficult or impossible to maintain physiological steady state. We know that very close to the aerobic anaerobic transition we have a catecholamine threshold. There are findings of a nonlinear increase in sympathetic activation manifested through the increases in the double product. There are some cardiovascular complications such as abnormalities in left ventricular function. There's suppression of immune function possibly linked to an exponential increase in cortisol. And there is recruitment of non-oxidative muscle fibers that change the patterns of coordination and therefore make it perhaps easier for muscular and skeletal injuries to occur. Fundamental assumption number 3. Affective responses rely on a hierarchically organized system with basic affective responses at the bottom, depending on oligosynaptic, mostly subcortical pathways, and emotions, complex, socioculturally framed emotions at the top that depend on polysynaptic and mostly cortically mediated pathways at the top. The control among these levels of the hierarchy can shift to match adaptational needs, what is most appropriate in a particular context. So, for example, in exercise, we may switch during an exercise session from very basic affective responses, such as the response associated with exertion or fatigue, to a more complex type of response, such as fear, if we feel some unfamiliar sensation in our chest, or embarrassment if we feel that we are a little bit overweight or out of shape, and so on. Joe Ledoux has been, I think, primarily responsible for bringing this idea to the forefront by proposing that we can have affective responses not only through what psychologists have considered for a long time the traditional high road that is mediated by the cortex, but also by a low road, in this case linking the sensory thalamus directly to the amygdala, in other words, producing an affective response without requiring cognitive elaboration by the cortex. Now, Ledoux based his idea on studies that were looking at exteroceptive stimuli, things like acoustic or visual stimuli. But I think that there is now enough information from neuroscience and neuroanatomy in particular that allow us to propose that, in fact, in the case of interoceptive stimuli, such as those associated with exercise, we don't have just one low road. We have multiple. We have a network of low roads. And therefore, in the case of exercise, a stimulus that produces interoceptive stimuli, it is possible to have those immediate, cognitively unmediated affective responses. And that network would look something like this. We have a set of physiological stimuli generated in the periphery. They reach a number of subcortical nuclei, the nucleus of the solitary tract, the parabrachial nucleus, ventrolateral medulla, periaqueductal gray, and we know from neuroanatomy that all of those areas, in fact, project to the amygdala. So not one low road, but in fact many low roads in the case of interoceptive stimuli. And of course, we also maintain the ability for the classical emotional pathway that goes through the cortex, the high road. My final assumption is that natural selection is a process that eliminates variation, whereas the presence of variation generally signals a lack of adaptive significance. What does that mean? It means that when it really matters, when there are really direct implications for adaptation, most humans tend to respond similarly. On the other hand, when there is no direct implication for adaptation, when it doesn't really matter, it's not going to influence our survival, then people tend to differ. In addition to that, responses that depend on evolutionarily older mechanisms show less individual variation. Things, for example, responses that depend on subcortical pathways, whereas those that depend on more recent mechanisms show greater variation, things that depend on cortical pathways, for example. So based on those four assumptions, here are the hypotheses associated with the dual mode theory. We assume that affective responses to physical activity depend on the interplay or interaction between two factors. Cognitive influences on the one hand, things like self-efficacy or social physique anxiety or fear or goal orientations, and interoceptive afferent cues, stimuli that arise from respiratory functions, and skeletal and muscular cues. The balance between these two general factors is hypothesized to shift systematically as a function of the intensity of physical activity. How? Cognitive factors, we hypothesize, are the primary influences when the intensity is challenging but not yet overwhelming, and we assume that that's somewhere near the transition from aerobic to anaerobic metabolism. Interoceptive factors, on the other hand, we assume become increasingly more important as an individual approaches his or her functional limits and the physiological steady state can no longer be maintained. So, as I promised, here are some data. 3 categories of data. First, we're going to look at patterns of affective responses. What are we expecting to find here? Are pleasure responses meaningfully associated with useful physical activity, and are displeasure responses meaningfully associated with what we assumed was dangerous intensity of physical activity? Before I jump into the data, let me refresh your memory. This is the circumplex model of affect. That's what I'm going to be using to map the affective responses on. If you remember, the horizontal dimension here is supposed to be affective valence, ranging from negative or displeasure to positive or pleasure. And the vertical dimension is perceived activation, ranging from low to high. So, our first paper that we did back in 2000 looked at low-intensity exercise stimuli that I think it is fair to say were well below the aerobic-anaerobic transition, specifically walking at a self-selected pace. And this is one of the 4 studies in that paper that I think is representative of the pattern that we found. The white line here shows the responses during, about halfway during, and at the end of a 15-minute walk on a treadmill. This is the last assessment, and this is what happened during a post-exercise 10-minute seated recovery. And these are the responses of the control group, not much change. As you can see, the primary change here is increase in activation and an improvement in valence. We have replicated the same study, essentially, with older adults, because walking, especially the self-selected pace, is perhaps a more relevant activity to older adults. And we did a rest-walk sequence and a walk-rest sequence. With the rest, what you see is a decrease in activation. With the walk, what you see is the same pattern that we found with the younger participants. In other words, an increase in activation, a slight improvement in valence. This is the walk-rest sequence, and you can see that the movement towards higher activation, more pleasure, happens first, and then this is the 15-minute rest period where you see the return to a low activation, pleasant state. How about higher intensity exercise? In this case, we looked at basically the minute-to-minute high temporal resolution assessments, responses to a graded treadmill test. And this is what happened. The VT here is the ventilatory threshold. As we start to run on the treadmill, there isn't much change in terms of valence up to the ventilatory threshold. But once we exceed the ventilatory threshold, it seems that, as Wally was saying, that's the turning point towards a more negative response. So gradually, beyond the ventilatory threshold, there is this movement towards higher activation and less positive initially, more negative eventually, valence. Once we stop the treadmill, remember Wally's data, once the exercise is stopped, within 1 minute of a cool-down walk, we see this dramatic rebound. Okay? And that continues into a more low-activated, pleasant state during a 20-minute seated recovery period. Now, we found this intriguing, so more recently we replicated that, make sure that it wasn't just a one-time phenomenon. So, again, we did a graded treadmill test, and we divided, because of the different durations of a graded treadmill test until the point of exhaustion, we divided our data into the first 2 minutes, the last 2 minutes, and then 4 minutes surrounding the ventilatory threshold. I'm going to show you side-by-side panels here with 30 subjects on the left and 30 subjects on the right. This is percentages of heart rate peak, and you can see, the typical response of heart rate, basically close to a linear response from beginning to end. These are the ratings of perceived exertion. As we progress through the stages, linear response until the end. Perceived activation, linear response until the end. But affective valence, quadratic response patterns. And then we went back and we divided the responses, looking at 3 at a time, trying to find which segment produced the quadratic pattern in particular. And the quadratic pattern was only for the set of 3 time points starting with a ventilatory threshold. So it's once we exceed the ventilatory threshold that the decline in affective valence begins to occur. Then we did, instead of incremental exercise, we did steady speed exercise for 15 minutes at 3 intensities. One below the ventilatory threshold, 20% below, one at the ventilatory threshold, and one 10% above. And you might be wondering why 10% above. Well, simply because if we did more, they wouldn't be able to run for 15 minutes. And what you see here is very minute changes in valence when they ran below the ventilatory threshold. Only a significant decline in valence from the beginning to the very end. But once you put them just 10% above the ventilatory threshold, and the leg muscles. So we divided the sample into obese, those were with a BMI more than 30, and those with BMI less than 30. And what we found was that, in fact, in the non-obese, the yellow line, the pattern was similar to what we had found for the younger participants, in the sense that the decline, in fact, did start with the ventilatory threshold. But for the obese, it was a whole different story. The obese, in fact, there was a group effect, because even before they stepped on the treadmill, their affective responses were more negative. Then we did a second session in which we let them choose their intensity. We'll let them select the speed that they liked. And what we found was that there was a gradual increase in the beginning, and then they seemed to stabilize around the ventilatory threshold. And in fact, at minutes 15 and 20 of a 20-minute session, the intensity was not significantly different from the ventilatory threshold. Now somebody might say, okay, so if we let them choose and they select the ventilatory threshold and everybody feels happy, then where's the problem? Well, the problem was highlighted earlier, and I want to highlight it again here, and that is individual differences. What you see here is the frequency distribution at minute 15, and at minute 15, the majority were at exactly 100% of the ventilatory threshold. But see the spread. And this is minute 20. Again, the majority right at 100%, but up to 160% of the ventilatory threshold, down to 60% of the ventilatory threshold. So a big effect of individual differences. Now, we have been able to account for a portion of this variability by a questionnaire that measures measures preferences for exercise intensity, but I don't have time to go into those data. Now, the third time, careful where you touch. Okay. The third time, we brought them back and we did 10% higher than what they self-selected. And what that did, from 100% of the VT, they went up to 120% of the VT in terms of oxygen uptake. This is what they reported in terms of valence during the self-selected. This is what they reported in terms of valence when we pushed them that just 10% more than what they themselves would have chosen. My second category looks at individual variability patterns. These are the responses. Each line here represents one or more individuals. And these are the responses to a 10-minute walk. These are the responses to a 30-minute cycling. I'm going to show you a response to higher intensity, but before we do that, about 75% of individuals reported improvements during the walk. We had a 50-50 split when the intensity was 60%. And 90 to 100% of individuals reported declines when the intensity was higher. So what we see again here is homogeneity when the intensity is low and the primary response is pleasure. Homogeneity when the intensity is very high, the primary response being displeasure, and variability when it's somewhere in the middle, around 60%. Finally, the third category looks at correlations between affective valence on the one hand and cognitive correlates and interoceptive correlates, or physiological correlates on the other hand. These are the correlations. Each dot here represents a correlation coefficient. And what we have here is the changes as we move from the very beginning, first stage of an incremental treadmill test all the way to exhaustion. These are the correlations between affective valence and self-efficacy as sort of the most commonly looked at cognitive correlate of affective responses. What you see here is that the correlations with a cognitive variable are significant only around the ventilatory threshold. They're not significant when the intensity is non-challenging, they're not significant when the intensity is basically overwhelming. Compare and contrast this pattern to this pattern. These are the relationships between affective valence and the respiratory exchange ratio, which I take as a physiological measure that has basically global meaning across individuals. It basically has very similar meaning. 1 or 1.1 means pretty much the same thing across different individuals. Now, the relationships here are negative. Okay? They go towards negative, so it's upside down. What we see here is as we exceed the ventilatory threshold, it is a physiological variable that becomes stronger and stronger correlate. If we put the two together, what we see is that the relationship, this is from a hierarchical linear regression, and what we see here is that as the intensity increases, the relationship with self-efficacy, or the contribution of self-efficacy, decreases, and the contribution of the respiratory exchange ratio gradually increases, becomes more and more important. I'm going to skip ahead because this shows basically the same thing from another study, and go to the conclusions. First of all, exercise does not necessarily make people feel better. The positive affective responses are limited to during and after low-intensity self-paced physical activity and the recovery, and only the recovery, from vigorous activity. The intensity that exceeds the ventilatory threshold or the onset of symptoms might be skeletal and muscular symptoms in the case, for example, of overweight individuals, is associated with declines in affective valence, not improvements. Moderate intensity exercise, 60 to 70% max, which we assumed for many years was the optimal condition, remember the inverted U hypothesis, is not necessarily optimal for positive affective change. It is only the recovery from moderate intensity that brings about unified positive responses. During moderate intensity, 60 or 70%, there is great inter-individual variability, with some individuals experiencing positive and others experiencing negative changes. Conclusion number 3, affective responses are not necessarily homogeneous. In fact, there are systematic, intensity-dependent patterns of inter-individual variability in affective responses. Homogeneity exists during low, where the primary response is positive, and during high, where the primary response is negative intensity. Variability exists during moderate intensity. Finally, how you think, in other words, the cognitive factors, is not necessarily the most important determinant of how you feel. The cognitive factors, in the examples I showed you, self-efficacy, but there may be others, may be the strongest determinant at intensities proximal to the aerobic and aerobic transition. Interoceptive factors appear to be the primary determinant at intensities exceeding the aerobic and aerobic transition. So this is the take-home message. We can divide the exercise intensity spectrum in 3 domains. Below the aerobic and aerobic transition, we have homogeneity, with pleasure being the dominant response, and low to moderate influence of cognitive factors. Then we have intensities that surround or approximate the aerobic and aerobic transition. Here we have variability, pleasure or displeasure, with strong influence of cognitive factors. And finally, we have intensities that exceed the ventilatory threshold or the aerobic and aerobic transition, approach exhaustion or fatigue. Here again we have homogeneity, but in this case displeasure as the predominant response, and strong influence of interoceptive factors. I'm going to jump ahead and thank you and open it up for questions.